Welcome! I'm so excited that you have decided to invest your time in our pandemic population conversations. And while you weren't able to meet a group in person, this will be part one of your self-study guide. You may choose to attend the second or third sessions in person or may continue with self-study. Whatever your option, we applaud you for putting forth the time and energy to learn more about how we support our military-connected youth through this next season. I'm Jenny Jordan. I will be the narrator for this session and help guide you through your next steps. I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping components. It is great for you to have your book right on hand. And in this case, if you haven't started your book yet, that's absolutely fine. The information that we're going to cover today is very much introductory, as it was for those who attended in person for this sessions. Once you do have your book, we encourage you to use it as a guide. There are lots of questions that Dr. Elmore has provided throughout the book. We want you to mark, highlight, circle, disagree with, whatever you need to. In each of your future sessions, you may be asked if you're in person to actually turn on your camera and mic if you can and respond so that we can have a true conversation. Additionally, we have placed you in a Flipgrid group. If you are 100% self-study, you are with all self-studiers. If you are one who is in a cohort and will also be participating with your cohort, that Flipgrid group is your cohort team. Don't forget to go back to those assignments so we can get to know each other better and learn a little bit more as we go along. So let's go ahead and get started. Our goal for this entire experience is to help us support, coach, plan, and lead our teens into that new normal or the next normal past the pandemic. Today specifically, we're going to look a little bit about generational influences, look at the characteristics of Generation Z, and hopefully through Flipgrid or in person at your next session, you'll connect with CYP, CYS, and 4-H staff. The idea from this came from with my colleagues after I read the book that Dr. Tim Elmore wrote, Pandemic Population. I've known of Tim for years. He is a leading researcher and youth development specialist and really works primarily with that high school age group. I've followed Growing Leaders, his blog, for some time and website, and also read several of his books. So when I knew that he was going to write about the pandemic, I wanted immediately to find a way that I could go through that. And as I read it, I thought, man, this would be so good for all of us to talk about as we move through this season of how we help our young people. If we flash back to last year, when all of a sudden the world began to shut down, we thought it was going to be a brief holiday, a few weeks. Then a few weeks stretched into a few months, and then all of a sudden it's a year later. So for many young people, this what we're in right now is normal, not where we were before, and we're going to be moving into something considerably different. So we're going to go ahead and dive right into thinking about our young people and what's happening in this world around us and all the generations we're working with as we move forward. Let's begin by thinking about the teens today. I'd like you to pause the recording and jot down some of the characteristics that you think of when you think of today's teen. Don't think about them in terms of the pandemic. Maybe even think about who they were beforehand. Go ahead and jot that down so you can begin to really think about what teenagers are like. I bet you've got a great list. And I hope our photos that actually came from a recent goose chase scavenger hunt that we held during Operation Megaphone. And they're all of teens doing the things that teens love, or preteens in some cases. When we think about teens today, they have very specific characteristics. There are things that make them, as a group, very unique from other groups that came before them. So let's talk just briefly a little bit about the generations we're interacting with. Sometimes within our families that we have, sometimes within our centers and all of the people that are employed with us. Sometimes it's just in the folks we know. The silent generation is that older generation, 76 and above. They were born between 1922 and 1945. And as we see when we look into this a little bit more deeply, they are that generation that came through World War II and the Great Depression, and that had a great impact on them. They were followed by the baby boomers, who were for years, decades, the largest generation ever born in this country. From 1946 to 64, there were babies born all the time. The baby boomers are 57 to 75 and very much have led the way in terms of what happens in business, what happens in families. They were followed by this very small, tiny group called Generation X, born in 1965 to 1980. They're the 41 to 56-year-olds that we're interacting with today. Our baby boomers and our Gen Xers gave birth to those millennials. And when we began looking at millennials, it was like the world was totally different. We didn't know what hit us. Those 25 to 40-year-olds now, born between 81 and 96, were a completely different breed until Gen Z came along. And in 1996 is when we begin to think about the Gen Z generation, and they're 10 to 24 years old. If you pause to think about the tremendous difference between a millennial and Gen Z, there is a historic event that greatly impacts where that group begins and ends. And it's basically whether or not you remember 9/11. Because for those born after 1996, 9/11 truly is a historical event. It is not something that took place in their lifetime that they remember. Now, in Tim's book, you might find the generations with slightly different names or off by a year or two. I've chosen these dates as the ones that kind of wrap around for me the historical data. And I want to talk specifically about when we talk about generations, what we mean. Because as you read about generations, sometimes it can be very frustrating, particularly when your generation isn't held in the greatest of all lights. Generations and discussing their attributes are generalizations. We can always find exceptions to the rule. As a good friend of mine says, everything's waiverable, so everything can have an exception. Generations are a sociological view versus a psychological view. Sociology looks at groups of people and how those groups of people, based on their culture, their age, their experiences, behave. Psychology looks at the individual person. So I, as an individual, may be very different than my Gen X generation, but as a group of people, you definitely can see correlations of behaviors that are very similar. And you can point to things in a historical context that greatly influence them. Let's think about that silent generation. We all know those silent are the greatest generations who save everything. My grandmother and her ball of tinfoil and every rubber band she ever came in contact with. And she was like everyone else in that generation. And do you know why? Because she remembers very clearly during her formative years that time when there was nothing. And so saving was a way to survive. And if we look at people in that generation, we see those characteristics together. What do we mean by formative years? Well, if we think about being birth to 90, we have this great scan of things that happen that form our worldview. And it's greatest in that formation from that age's birth till about 20. Our worldview does not change a lot as we get older into our 80s and 90s. Our worldview is much more influenced on that earlier span of our lifetime. And it's in that earlier time, before we're 20 years old, that those external factors greatly influence what's happening to us. That vertical dash that really impacts what's going on. We have social factors in the top half of that triangle and our personal factors. And our social factors are those things that are happening in the world around us. And even though they both influence us, as you know, there's a lot more of them in that early time. So it's during this blued-in area that our formative years greatly shape our worldview. That doesn't mean that when you have a significant event happen to you when you're in your 30s and 40s, it might not change how you think about the world. But our ideas, our beliefs, our way of being is greatly influenced by those external factors that come into play at that before 20 years old. So as we think about that, a generation is simply that group of people who witness the same historical events and have similar sociological influences. Now, it's important to remember for us, we all witness those events as well that Gen Z is witnessing. But remember our grid again, we're witnessing those at a time when they're not impacting us in the same ways. At the end of the day, it's all about perspective. And I love this about D-Day because all these kids have very different answers. And if you look at the cartoons, they have very different reasons why they think what they think. I've often asked a group, what do you think of when I say moonwalk? And I want you to jot that down. I bet someone who paused and jotted down moonwalk immediately thought of the day Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But what about Michael Jackson and that famous moonwalk? Depending on your age group, you've probably tried to mimic it. And I've also had a generation of millennials say, isn't that the thing that used to come to birthday parties? Meaning that bounce house that was called the moonwalk. None of the terms are wrong. It's all about perspective. We had a great number of things influence our perspectives in our formative years. And as we look across this and we look at the differences of things that and the attitudes and attributes that take place among these generations, we can definitely see how what happened in those formative years were shaping them. I used the example of the Great Depression earlier. When we look at Generation X and some of the things that were going on in their world, our millennials, natural disasters, and that pocket technology. Everything on the list isn't necessarily negative, but there's lots of things on the list that greatly change things. Now, I want to speak to Gen Z. We are focusing right now on the pandemic, but if we look at them as a generation as a whole, there are a lot of things that have been shaping that worldview. Gun violence is at an all-time high. We look at millennials and their school shootings. Many of us can probably name a school shooting or two. We know Columbine and Sandy Hook, but there have been thousands since then. It's those first ones that just really hit the news that resonate. Last year, there were more incidents of gun violence in terms of a mass shooting where more than 5 people were killed than there were days in a year. That plays out all the time around Gen Z. They are all tech all the time. Instead of being handed a rattle as a child, they were probably handed a cell phone to entertain themselves. And they are a 5 screens at once kind of group. They are on their phones, their computers, their iPads, everything all at the same time. And that instant access has changed the way they demand information. Now, on that middle line in there where it says movements in election first, I didn't have 5 lines. That's why they're mixed together. But I want to kind of speak to that. Because in addition to the Me Too and Black Lives Matter and all the other movements and social unrest that we've seen come forward and people rally behind and say, we need a change, we need to be fair, we've also had tremendous firsts in our elections. And I don't just mean this year. We had the first African-American president in Obama. We had the first woman vice president, along with a lot of other firsts, in Harris. We had a first non-Washington insider in Trump. We have had states and communities that have voted one way for decades swap their votes. We had more young people than ever turn out for Obama's election until this election. And as you think about that, it is changing the way we make decisions as a country. And that's all part of Gen Z's worldview and formation. So let's think a little bit about these characteristics. You know, when we think about our boomers, they were very keeping up with the Joneses, living through Vietnam and civil rights. They like to talk on the phone. They accept digital. Titles and money matter to them. That Gen Z group Gen X group adopted digital. They're into emailing. They're latchkey kids. It has been said that Generation X has waited their lifetime for the pandemic where they could stay home and do what they wanted, because that's pretty much what Gen X does best, be independent. Gen Y was raised by boomers and Xers who gave them a trophy for everything they did. They're digital natives, but they really want to make a difference. And then just this Gen Z, they are so tech innate. They want photos out there. If you want to talk to them, they need an image. They're the most diverse group ever in our history. So as we think about all these differences, it's important for us to acknowledge where we fall on that scale, because as we think about if we're a boomer and we're looking at a Z, we may have some issues communicating. If we're a Gen Xer who's training a millennial to work with a Z, we may have some very different approaches. So understanding those basics can be real important. I think the most important thing, though, is at the end of the day to remember we all need a life of meaning and to make a difference. What that means to us may be different, though. How I feel like I make a difference may be very different than how a silent or a boomer or a Z feels. We all want freedom, autonomy, and independence. For a millennial, freedom is I can do my work when I want to do my work. For a baby boomer, freedom may be retirement. Independence comes very differently for all of our groups. And we all need connections and relationships, and how we connect and relate could be very different. So keep it in mind when we're trying to figure out how do we reach these Z's and we're using what we like, we may need to figure out what they like. And that's a different mindset to move into. So let's think pandemic. We've scratched the surface of some very deep research of generations, and Tim does a beautiful job in the book. If you haven't already read chapters 1 and 2, you'll really dive more deeply into this topic, and he talks a lot about some of the similarities and differences and what we can learn from our generations and how we work with Gen Z. So if you're not there yet, dive in. You'll really enjoy it. But as we think about Gen Z, I want you to think specifically about how the pandemic has influenced them. So pause the recording again and go ahead and jot down your notes of what behaviors are you seeing with Gen Z in this pandemic that may be new to what you've seen before. I'm glad you're back. I hope you jotted down lots of different ideas. You know, as we discuss this with others and we read in the book, a lot of things we think about is that for a group that is technologically innate, that loves their technology, they are over online learning. It has become increasingly more and more difficult to gather teens together in an online environment because they're tired of it. But we also gather them in online environments that last a really long time. And what do they love? They love Snapchat, picture here and it's gone, TikTok, quick shorts. That's what they're looking for. Yet we want to engage in a much longer time period. Lots of them are very interested in basic skills. I don't know if it's because it's what's been lacking or if it's just as we all went home, we began to, everyone was baking bread, then everyone was making a garden. Everyone was, we're doing some very basic things. And Gen Z has picked up on wanting to learn more and more of those things. Gen Z are missing their friends. While it's really cool that we can connect online, there is nothing like the connection to that person that we see that's right beside us. I think about for our military connected youth who may have been, or any youth who may have been moving during the pandemic. You've moved to a new community and you have online school. Sports aren't being played and your churches are virtual. There aren't clubs and organizations meeting unless you go to an online environment. So how do you make new friends? Now, it's great that you can easily keep in touch with your old friends. You don't just have to pick up the phone and call them. You can really look at them and have a whole conversation. But I think back to my high school days when you would sit down in class and turn to the person next to you and start talking. And all of a sudden you made a new friend because they were seated in your proximity. That's not going to happen in Zoom because you can turn off your camera and never speak. And so for Gen Z, in a period in their lives where forming social relationships are so important, they are lacking the literal ability to be with people to do that. And if we don't teach them how to do that, we could have a generation that really lacks the ability to make deep connections in a personal way. We know that for our younger teens too, this isolation can be so dramatic in their really forging those social relationships. And for our older teens, they are plagued greatly by what are they going to do next. And you'll see one of the things Tim speaks to eloquently, and I think it's a great reminder for all of us, is that we are their leaders and we don't know what's next. So how can they and how can we support them? Which brings us to the next question. I challenge you to go ahead and pause and think about everything we've talked about. What does it mean to you and what does it mean to you as you move forward? How does this information apply to what you're doing? You may find it's applying to those that you're training and leading in your center, the adults. You may also find that it greatly is impacting how you're working with kids, how we're shifting our thinking to not go back to how the things were before, but how do we make them work next? I challenge you to go look at your group's information so that you can maybe pop in with your cohort group for their second session. You will have seen everything that they saw. You'll be right on time with them. You also will have known what their reading is. Usually most of our groups read chapters 1 through 3 or 1 through 4. And don't forget to access your Flipgrid to do your introduction and whatever other assignment is in Flipgrid as well. Please keep in mind too, if you ever need anything, if you have any questions or you need any help, please reach out to me. The emails come from me. I'm happy to help you out. We can add your Gmail account or another account outside of your work email account if that's helpful to you to also receive the information. Or if you're still looking for your book and you need to figure out how to get that, just let me know. From time to time, Amazon has challenges and I'm happy to fix it as best we can. We want this experience to be good for you. And the best way it's to be good for you is if you spend some time investing, thinking, and learning. We have shared, in addition to this recorded 20-minute video, a little bit over, a worksheet just to get you thinking. Again, this is for you, and we hope it'll be a great guide for your self-study. What's next? You'll get into reading. Thank you so much for spending time in our conversation, and I hope you'll be able to join us in one of our more live groups. Till next time, thanks so much.